he operated ships and then later entered the business of being a merchant, actually buying and selling cargoes for his own account. His wife Sally was from Brewster, and they married. They lived in the Atkins homestead, which was either in Truro or Eastham, or Outer Cape Cod. And by the time Alicia was 5 years old, his father decided they needed to move closer to Boston because he sailed out of the port of Boston. So they made their home in Roxbury, which was a small village at this time in the 18-teens. And Alicia attended the Roxbury Latin School. By the age of 16, he was actively working on the waterfront. He would walk down to the wharfs down by India Wharf, Rose Wharf, Long Wharf. That area was very busy with ships, if you've seen the old photographs from that era. His father decided by the time Alicia was 18 years old, there was more opportunity in New York, so moved the family to Brooklyn, but Alicia, at age 18, became independent. He wanted to stay in Boston and make his fortune here, and actually entered into business at quite a young age. He started in business 1835. 2 years later, we had the Panic of 1837, one of the catastrophic economic downturns. He sort of has to start over and enters a relationship with William Freeman, which continues for several years. But that effort isn't successful, and Atkins strikes out on his own in 1843. It does though, form a relationship with William's daughter, Mary, and they become a couple. They marry in 1844. They had several children. They actually had 6 children together. The first 3 died in infancy. So it was their 4th child, Edwin, that we're going to be talking about here. He was born in 1850, and I'll be talking about him when we get to the next module. So for the next 30 years, Alicia builds his own business, trading in the Caribbean, initially in a variety of commodities and a variety of ports all around the so-called Spanish Main, the whole coastline surrounding the Caribbean Sea. But as time goes on, he becomes more and more focused on Cuba specifically, sugar as a commodity specifically, and during this period of time, over 25, 30 years, the volume of trade between Cuba and Boston, in particular, the port of Cienfuegos and the city of Boston, grows by 10 times. Atkins dominates that trade. So we're talking about the largest trader in sugar, in the largest export port in the Caribbean, and the largest import point in the United States. Now, when we get to the 1870s, he starts to hand off responsibility for the sugar business to his son, Edwin, and we'll be talking about Edwin in a little bit. And he shifts his focus more to the emerging railroad industry. So in the late 19th century, the country's in a railroad boom. He is a senior officer, director, and vice president of the Union Pacific, the first transcontinental railroad crossing the United States. He also specifically backed a rail line in Arkansas. And if you look at the picture on the bottom of the screen of the Fan Pier area on the Boston waterfront that has been so redeveloped over the last 20 or 30 years. Well, if you remember, if you were here in the 70s or 80s, that area used to be all piers for shipping, and the Port of Boston really went into decline in the mid-20th century. But in this era, it was extremely active. It required a great deal of rail infrastructure, and Alicia was responsible for initiating and leading that effort, the so-called Boston Wharf Company. Now, how did the Atkins family come to Belmont? They actually, their whole life, they lived in the city of Boston. That was their legal residence, Alicia and Mary. But in 1857, they started renting a house, and this looks very much like the Belmont Women's Club house, but I don't believe it is. I think it was another house that no longer exists. It apparently was built by William F. Homer, who also built the Women's Club. So it may well be, it bears a strong similarity, but I see some differences. In any event, after about 15, I think 17 years, they decide to purchase a home. They had quite a large, gracious old home up at 580 Concord Avenue. That house was remodeled, expanded. It was taken down. What's there now is a later house. This is the house where Anne Allen actually lived right up to the end of her life. And a member here, but right up until she died 10 years ago, was Alicia's great-granddaughter. So I have been looking, I can't find where they actually signed the membership book, because our membership book from that era was lost in the fire that destroyed our old church. But I'm going to continue to search through the parish records to see if there's any record of when the Atkins family formally became members of our church. Edwin and his wife Catherine were married in the old building in 1882, as we'll talk about shortly. Now, Alicia, we come to the late 1880s. He remains active and vigorous, but his health does begin to decline, and a tragic event, I think, precipitates his death. One of his surviving children, his daughter Helen, who the married name was Edmonds, died in childbirth in January of 1888, as did the infant from that birth. And so if you visit we talked about this the other day. I did a presentation about the First Church founders at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And if you visit that gravesite, you will see the marker commemorating Alicia and his wife Mary, and surrounding it, you'll see on the lower part of the image, you see the 3 young children who were lost before Edwin was born, and then you'll see the marker for Helen and her infant child. So in the reminiscences that were written about Alicia's life by his son-in-law, William Howell Reed, he suggests that the loss of his daughter may have precipitated his declining health and his death in December of 1888. After his death, he was widely remembered and I think, I would say, revered in many of the industries in which he participated. That included railroad shipping, sugar, and he was a bank director of a number of financial enterprises as well. Now we're going to shift focus and talk specifically about Edwin, who I think is the pivotal character in this story. And Sam is going to be talking specifically about the era when Edwin really built the presence in Cuba. As I mentioned, Edwin was born in Boston. He attended a school called the Brooks Classical School. This is not the modern Brooks School in North Andover, which was followed later. So there were a number of small private schools in Boston at that time. He would have begun spending his summers in Belmont at age 7, 1857, and was here for a number of years. But when he was 16 years old, his father brought him on a trip to Cuba, and after that point, he began making annual trips to the island and started to pick up managerial responsibility. He was 24 years old when his father effectively made him the primary managing partner in the Cuban enterprise. As I mentioned, he met Catherine it was actually at a horse race in Lexington in 1881. They were married in 1882. and they would have 3 children. Their son, Robert Atkins, so if you think of Congressman Chet Atkins, he was the descendant from that branch of the family. A daughter named Helen, who married, was it William Claflin, who was the treasurer of Harvard University, and the Claflins had several children, some who maintained membership here for a number of years. And then a daughter named Grace, who married William Howell Reed, the author of the memoir or the biography about Alicia. So Edwin becomes a major industrialist, and Sam is really going to explore this era of his life. But we're talking about a really aggressive expansion into Cuba. This was a period of political chaos. There was a 10-year-long civil war in Cuba where a number of the plantation owners went into deep debt to the Atkins enterprise, and ultimately, as it happens, Atkins foreclosed on several of these properties, took direct ownership, and so he actually became the owner of the plantations. He forward integrated into ownership, growing sugar cane, and modernizing the operations, dramatically increased the yield from these plantations, which had been not terribly well managed over the years. And he did, by virtue of this direct ownership, he became the legal owner of the enslaved workers on the plantations for the final period of years. There had been an agreement to end legal slavery in Cuba on a scheduled basis. And so he became, we heard, the last legal slaveholder in the Western Hemisphere as a consequence of foreclosing on these properties. Now I'm going to jump forward to the latter part of his career. As we mentioned, 1888 was the year of Alicia's death. This building was constructed in 89 and dedicated in 1890, and so that was the timing of the gift of the window. And you see the date of Alicia's death in 1888. So Edwin assumes several of the responsibilities that Alicia had in the Boston Wharf Company, a number of other industries. He was a director at Westinghouse Electric, for example. Several banks. He was a director of the Belmont Savings Bank. And the Atkins, at this point, Edwin and Catherine, they are also quite philanthropic. The Atkins family donated about 3/4 of the cost to acquire the Beaver Brook Reservation, which becomes the first parkland in the Metropolitan District Commission MDC system of parks surrounding Boston in the late 19th century. He founded a botanical garden in Cuba, which would later management would be turned over to Harvard. You're going to be will you be mentioning the botanical garden a little bit? I think it, yeah. So he begins to roll off his professional responsibilities starting around 1915, 1920. He gradually relinquishes his role in the sugar industry, and he dies in 1926. And if you're looking for more information about Edmund, he wrote his own memoirs, a book called 60 Years in Cuba. It's available online, and there are actually 2 physical copies in the platform room at the Belmont Public Library, the Belmont Historical Society room. Get there quick before our library gets torn down. I've been on a mad here to get as much information as I can at the Historical Society, knowing that for the next few years it could be a little tough to access those records. And now we're going to turn to the third major character. This is Edwin's wife, Catherine. She was born in 1860, so she's a good 10 years younger than her husband. And she is the daughter of the proprietor of 2 large, they're not terribly large, but the Tremont House and the Revere House were 2 prominent hotels in downtown Boston. Tremont House right along Tremont Street, and the Revere House, I think, was down around Bowdoin Square, where I used to work in the Salt and Stall State Office building, and I think it sat right on that plot. She went by Kitty. She was not extensively schooled. She attended school to age 12, but then her mother really educated her at home, I think, to be a homemaker. But as Helen Claflin describes in her family memoir, she was schooled in the household arts of sewing, cooking, and the social graces. I don't know if anybody here, I think we're all probably way too young to have known Catherine, but she must have been quite a presence, very energetic, but a very refined person too. So I think she would have been quite an interesting person to know. Despite her limited formal education, she was deeply well-read. Her father used to take her to the Boston Athenaeum. She loved Shakespeare. She could recite a lot of Shakespeare. So she was, I think, probably a very classy person. So they meet, Edwin and Catherine meet at this horse race in Lexington. They fall in love. They're married in our church. And then there's a period of time, about 7 years, while they are a young couple, where she travels with Edwin to Cuba. And they live at a plantation home on the Soledad plantation. There's a little description of this in Helen's memoir about Catherine's life. It sounded like it was challenging. She writes that they were, a handful of white people of European extraction among a group of hundreds, if not a couple of thousand, Afro-Caribbean enslaved people. And it was a challenging period for her, but she was certainly a person of privilege in those circumstances. She does come back to Belmont, and she spends the next 17 years raising her children here, so she's not going to Cuba that much. But there is a period of time later in life where Catherine and Edwin resume going to Cuba. And the picture on the right of the screen of Edwin and Catherine, this is 1917, so that's how she would have appeared in her late 50s. And now we get to the latter part of Catherine's life. There's a tragic period where she loses her younger son, Ted, in a plane crash going to Cuba, along with a couple of grandchildren. And so you can find those markers at the Mount Auburn Cemetery as well. Not long after, a couple of years later, her husband dies. And so in the late 20s, Catherine, who is now, after having raised her family and spent several decades with her husband, she's now in a more solitary period of her life. She makes a memorial gift to our church of this spectacular organ that surrounds us. It was offered actually in mid-1929, initially on an anonymous basis. The church decided they really had to do some significant remodeling and redecorating as part of incorporating the organ into the church edifice. It's way too big for this building. I mean, it's why when Simon kind of blows out the pipes, you know that organ is oversized for our church. It was designed for a large theater, is the reason why. And the theater enterprise failed, so the organ became available. I don't know what the economic value was. I think it was in the range of $12,000–$14,000. This at a time when our annual budget was around $11,000 or $12,000. So think of it in those terms. But the fact is, she made the gift right as the country was beginning to go into a downturn. So we did enter a period of extreme stringency here at the church during the Depression. Those of you who heard the talk I gave a couple of months ago about the ministry of Henry Wilder Foote, this was a difficult period here. During the 30s, Catherine would often backstop the budget deficits here. She was deeply involved in this church. She would host the parish committee meetings. She oversaw buildings and grounds. I mean, she was one of the characters for decades who really kept this place going, even in the face of some severe financial difficulties. She also helped to found a couple of other Belmont service organizations here. I mentioned the Family Service Society and the Hospital Aid Organization. It was interesting to see, as I read Helen Claflin's family memoir, that Edwin, on a posthumous basis, and Catherine were given a prestigious medal in Cuba by the Cuban government for the work that they had done there over the years. She then dies in 1953 at long life, 93 years. So this was a woman who clearly had an extraordinary life. It was a life of privilege, as are many of our lives. But I think we know as we dig into this story that this privilege was based in some significant measure on the exploitation of slave labor. And Sam is going to be talking about that, and we're hoping to explore in our discussion session how do we react to that reality. So that's the end of my module here, and now I'm going to hand the mic to Lanier to talk about the window itself. Okay.
I'm going to present our window in the context of Tiffany stained glass. So this is definitely a departure from what John has been talking about, but I want us to be grounded in our window and its importance in the history of Tiffany glass and in our church as well. There have been, and this I'm going to go a little bit back in history. There have been two periods of stained glass production that have been really important. The first, of course, is during the Gothic period in the late Middle Ages, when all of the cathedrals were being built all over France, particularly in other places in Europe. Those churches, everybody understands, everybody knows that the Gothic style is characterized by the pointed arch that gives tremendous verticality. The flying buttresses out to the side eliminate the need for walls, and so those are buildings that could be completely open. They're sort of skeletal structures, and in place of a wall, they were filled in with glass, and that created a sort of mystery because the clear light comes through the glass and then is transformed into a glow inside the building that creates a sort of mysterious feeling. And also, how is this building holding up? What's supporting the vaulting overhead? It's a sort of mystery that's analogous. We think that people were thinking this possibly, analogous to the mystery of the birth of Jesus at the end of the Middle Ages. The architecture sort of carries that idea of mystery and the miracle of the birth of Jesus into architecture. So the second period of great production of stained glass is in the second half of the 19th century in America, not really other places, but in America. The conditions, in some sense, were similar to the 13th century. There were three things which occurred. First of all, there was a great flourishing of religious fervor. There was a lot of church building in the second half of the 19th century, and it's been estimated that in the year of 1875, 4,000 churches were under construction in this country. So, of course, those churches gave ample opportunity for stained glass windows. Our church is not in the Gothic style, of course. We have heavy walls, but we have the windows at the back and we have the window at the front. So it fits into this idea of the architecture and the windows going together. So a new art form, essentially a new art form of art glass developed by Lafarge and Tiffany to fill the spaces that these windows call for. So that's the second. The first is the religious fervor and the building of the churches. The second is the development of the Tiffany stained glass window, this new art form to fill in the space. And the third point is the wealth that was generated in the late 19th century, or the second half of the 19th century, to afford these building projects and to make all of this possible. So our window is squarely in the middle of this development of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. And I was going to do a timeline, but John has sort of done it, but I'll just have a few things to plug in, which he didn't mention. 1888, of course, Alicia Atkins dies, and the construction on this church begins the next year in 1889. Now, in February of 1890, there was an exhibit in New York City in the Tiffany studio, and 35 windows were on display for 2 days. People filed in to see the windows, and they were written up in newspaper accounts all over the country. This was a big deal that this many windows were visible in one place, and our window was on display in February of 1890. In April the 18th of 1890, the building was dedicated. And Edwin Atkins was the chair of the parish board. And it's unlikely that they opened the church and had the formal dedication without this window being in place. I don't find any reference to that, but I haven't gone all the way through the archives, but I don't see a reference to the window, but it seems, I think we can assume that it was in place at that point. So a little bit about the iconography of the window. It's called the Weary Pilgrim, or sometimes just the Pilgrim window. Sometimes it's referred to as the guardian angel, and that would be if people are focusing on the angel itself, which is, I don't know what this is. Well, you can call it the angel. Or the pilgrim. And the way that we identify it as the pilgrim is because right there on his hat is a little circle, and it's hard to see it as a shell, but in the Middle Ages, the shell of Santiago de Compostela was what anyone who made the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, St. James of Compostela on the Atlantic coast of Spain, would come back home with the shell as proof that they had made that visit. Santiago de Compostela was the most important pilgrimage point in Europe beyond Rome. And to get to Rome, you had to cross the Alps. I had to cross the Pyrenees to get to Santiago de Compostela, but that was not as daunting as crossing the Alps. So many more people went to Santiago de Compostela than went to Rome. So that's the iconography, the angel comforting the pilgrim who's weary on his pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, but symbolizing all pilgrims, all searchers, all making a voyage through life to symbolize their faith. So then a little bit about the technique. Our window is typical of colored glass as developed in the Middle Ages and as continued and altered somewhat by Tiffany. Just to explain how stained glass window is made, maybe you all know this, but anyway, you would, on a large table, a full-size cartoon would be drawn, and then pieces of glass would be shaped, cut to shape, to fit the individual parts of the window. And then lead strips would be wrapped around each piece to form a sort of network that would hold the pieces in place, and also to outline the forms of the drawing, the forms of the design for the window. Now, lead is the perfect material to form this net because it's very pliable and it could be shaped to fit pieces of glass with a lot of detail in that. But it's also flawed because it's very weak. It doesn't have the strength that's needed to hold heavy glass in place. So for that, you had to have iron bars. And those, of course, as you can see here, cut across, usually in a grid, as you see it here. It cuts across the design. So the design has to be created in a way that doesn't obstruct the focus of the image, whatever that happens to be. In the late Middle Ages, windows are tall and sharp, and usually it's a series of roundel shapes where they're stacked on top of one another rather than a grid, but different times it's done different ways. The final thing about the way they're done is that the faces and the hands are usually painted on the glass because the lead strips are a little too heavy-handed to make those detailed aspects of the human body. So that would be painted. Now, everything that I've been telling you about is the way it was done in the Middle Ages and the way it's done here, except that in the Middle Ages, the individual pieces were usually quite small, and here there's some fairly large pieces. But that's because through the manipulation of the glass, Tiffany was able to create more interior detail within the individual pieces. So that's what I want to talk about now. It's the experiments that Tiffany introduced in the stained glass window and the changes in color and in technique. Now, in the Middle Ages, through adding chemicals to the glass when it was in a molten state, they could create very vivid reds and blues. And so those are the main colors that you see in medieval stained glass. They could get a sort of pale green or yellow, but those were not as forceful or dramatic as the other red and blue. So they're not used as much either. But what Tiffany did was to expand the color range. I mean, this is so unusual if you're thinking of it in terms of medieval color, because this is not the sort of red you would see in a medieval window. This is a sort of orange red, which is a completely different sort of red. And you would never see this green. I'm going to dispense with that, it's not working. The green that's in his robe, the angel's robe. Angels don't have a gender. The angel's robe. You would never find that expanse of green color or that intensity of green color in medieval glass. So this expansion of the color palette is very important. And then the introduction of an opalescent glass, which you can see in the wings of the angel, is completely new and was never used in medieval glass at all. And then there's the texture. Through a lot of experiments with manipulating glass, different textures were achieved. If you look at the orange of the robe of the pilgrim, it's got lines in it. And those lines, or what look like lines, the folds of the drapery, they're the result of when the glass is spread out on the flat table, when it's in a malleable form still, it could be sort of bunched up or almost like pleated, or folds created in the thickness of the glass, so that then it becomes extremely heavy, but it also allows for a difference in value in the depth of the glass, and you could be then used for something like drapery folds, to look like drapery folds. Another technique that Tiffany introduced was the idea of overlapping pieces of glass, again where it's still in a molten state, and that was made possible to sort of painterly form that you have. If you look at the angel's robe, the green is not the same green from one side to the other of a piece, but it looks sort of mottled or has some variety in it. And that would be done by layering several pieces of glass on top of one another, fusing them together, and then it would give more depth to the color. And you see that all the way through this, that there's a lot of painterly quality to the glass, which, I mean, you can't paint, you can paint on glass, but you can't paint with glass. But Tiffany has done the best substitute possible with that. So to sort of continue a little bit with the timeline, we don't, at least so far as I know, have any reference in the archives about the stained glass until we get to Diana Miller, I know, in the 1880s, 1980s, sorry, gave a lecture or a sermon on the window. But I'm sure I was here and I don't remember totally, but I'm pretty sure that she was talking about the iconography or the subject of the window rather than the technique or the history of the window. The next thing that happens is that in 1992, we received as a gift this drawing, this study that's down here in front of me. This was found by Anne Allen, who's been mentioned, the granddaughter of Edwin, the one who donated the window. She found it in her attic, or her mother's attic. After her mother had died, clearing out the attic, they found this drawing, which was probably the presentation drawing, which would have been given to Edwin when he commissioned the window to show what it was going to look like, and then it stayed in the family. It's watercolor and gouache on paper, about 19 inches by 32 inches or so. Now, it's very fortunate that it was given to us at that point, because not long after that, the house burned down, and the study would have been lost completely if we hadn't been given it at that point. So it was put away and forgotten for about 20 years. And then at a certain point, Martha Gallagher was active in the church. At that point, she was also employed at the MFA, and she made arrangements for the drawing to be given on a long-term loan to the Museum of Fine Arts. And in exchange, they gave us this. This is not the original. This is the photographic copy of the original drawing. So it's much safer in their hands than it would have been in ours. It was just in a closet with us before it was given to them. Once the museum had it, they put it on display for 6 months in 2012, and only for 6 months. Works on paper are frequently not shown for long periods of time because the paper is fragile, the color is not stable, so I don't know when it will ever be displayed again, but probably not for quite some time. There was a plaque with it indicating the relationship between the drawing. It was in part of an exhibit that included a lot about Tiffany glass, and this explained that this was a study for a window in Belmont and Missionary Church and so on. So the next thing in the history is what has happened to preserve and maintain it. Around the same time, people began to notice that there were little specks of light coming through the window, and it needed some attention. Fortunately, the Alliance had been putting money aside from the rummage sale over a long period of time with the idea that they would be the custodians of the windows. They had already had some work done on the windows at the back, and we had this analyzed and a pretty hefty price tag put on the work that would need to be done, but fortunately more than half of that was available from the Alliance fund. Ann Allen, the beneficent Ann Allen, gave us some more money towards that, and then there was a bequest from someone's will that was added to it, and a small fundraising attempt was put in place to raise the money for it. So it had to be taken down. It was re-leaded and reputtied. It was cleaned thoroughly, of course, and a protective glass on the back of it was put in place. So that was done in 2006-07, and then unfortunately, 7 years later, we began to notice that it was buckling. It was not stable. It was kind of sagging a bit, and it had to be taken down again, reworked, strengthened with heavier bars and more ties to attach the web of lead to the bars, and then put back up again. And so far it's held since that work. We don't really know what caused that failure, but it could have been simply the materials. The putty that had been used originally had lasted for more than 100 years, but it had lead in it, and you couldn't use putty like that in the present day. So the putty that was used was probably weaker than the original putty, and the result was that it failed somewhat, so it had to be strengthened. So, some concluding thoughts. One thing is that people always ask how much something like this is worth. Well, it's hard to put a price tag on something like this. It's priceless. It couldn't be replaced. But it has been insured, and so that gives us some idea of a price tag that somebody might put. Price tag is the wrong word. Value that someone might put on it. When the work was being done to repair it, it was insured for $919,000 and change. So that gives you some idea. And when we first got it and appraised it, it was appraised at $7,500. And when the museum got it, they insured it for $10,000. So that gives you an idea of the value of what we have in the church. So I want to make a pitch before we get into what we're going to do. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping ahead on this, but I want to make a public statement of how fortunate I think we are in the survival of our church and our window. Anybody who works in art history knows that the history of art is based on a very small portion of the art that's been created, because most has been lost in the history. Very little actually survives. Most is lost by deterioration, damage, ravages of time, destruction of war, natural disasters, floods, fire, earthquakes, which we're hearing a lot about right now, and then equally important, the change of taste, which doesn't value what is old and out of style. And so things are simply neglected, lost, destroyed. We've been fortunate that parish boards have maintained the building so it's not falling down, and that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Alliance to have the foresight to put aside the money in anticipation of repairs, and particularly to Nancy Davis, who did a huge amount of work in connection with both of the periods of work on restoration on the window, and also Jerry Strickler, who has been a member of our church and conservatory at the Museum of Fine Arts, and did an immense amount of work as well. So my hope is that there will always be church members who value what we have and will continue to be good stewards of the gifts we've been given. So.
I have Bill's very detailed presentation notes, and I'll be working from those, but do bear with me. All right. So the photographs that you're seeing right now, they are reproduced from a book that was published in 1926. It was published here in Cambridge with the title 60 Years in Cuba, Reminiscences of Edwin F. Atkins, and that's from the collection in the Massachusetts Historical Society. The photograph at the bottom, these are presumably, I actually don't know positively, but these are presumably photographs of the Soledad plantation, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit. The photograph at the bottom left, we know a couple of those figures in that photograph. So the gentleman with the white beard who's mounted on a horse in the foreground, that is Alicia Atkins, the patriarch of the family, who is memorialized in the window, who's named in the window. And the gentleman with the white hat who is standing, that's J.S. Murray, who I also mentioned. He was the Atkins family's land manager in the Soledad plantation. So we'll get to him. Okay. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the history of the slave trade in Cuba. We'll talk a bit about the sugar industry in Cuba, and then about the Atkins family's purchase of the Soledad plantation, how that came about, and a few other things. We'll start with some deep history. So it was in the early 1500s that Spanish colonizers started producing sugarcane in Cuba. Slaves provided the labor for sugarcane production and for converting sugarcane to sugar and molasses. There were multiple slave populations in Cuba at different periods in history. So first, the indigenous populations of the Taino and Guanahabatí people were enslaved, and they disappeared as separate populations. No full-blood Taino survived the 1600s, so the native people in Cuba were the first peoples to be enslaved. Slaves from Africa were imported into Cuba in order to meet the growing need for slaves. The slave population in Cuba increased from 39,000 in the 1770s to 400,000 in the 1840s, until it was roughly a third of the entire Cuban population. There were 600,000 African slaves who were imported into Cuba during the 19th century. Mostly this was after 1820, when Great Britain and Spain agreed to end slave trading in the Spanish colonies. But Cuban plantation owners insisted on continuing the slave trade, which finally ended in 1867. As a result of pressure on the slave trade, 100,000 indentured Chinese workers were also imported into Cuba. So a little bit about sugar production in Cuba. So in the period 1838 to 1880, the Cuban sugar industry became the most mechanized in the world, relying on steam-powered mills and narrow-gauge railroads. By 1850, sugar production accounted for 80% of all exports from Cuba. In 1860, Cuba produced nearly 1/3 of the world's sugar. Sugarcane production depended throughout on slave labor for cultivation, for cutting crops, for hauling wagons, and for processing cane, which involved crushing and boiling to produce a sticky brown syrup using dangerous equipment. The living conditions of these slaves were, as one might imagine, often very harsh. They had 20-hour work days during the harvest. They resided under extremely cramped, unhygienic conditions in so-called barracoons. The disciplinary measures included lengthy periods of confinement in stocks, in boiler houses, and whippings. Under the so-called Spanish Black Code of 1789, there were improvements in conditions, but the code was frequently ignored by the plantation owners who considered it a challenge to their authority. The end of Cuban slavery is quite complicated. So the slave system in Cuba gradually disappeared between 1868 and 1886. It didn't end all at once. A rebellion in 1868 in the eastern department of Cuba started what we now term the 10-Year War, which John alluded to earlier. This was a rebellion by a group of small-scale planters provoked by Spain's multiple failings as an imperial power, by high taxes, and by economic hardship. These rebels called for eventual emancipation of slaves after the revolution was successful. The need for recruits forced the rebels in 1870 to call for immediate emancipation. However, insurgent leaders treated former slaves, libertos, as forced laborers. In response to this rebellion, the Spanish government proclaimed the Moray Law in 1870. This was, quote, a preparatory bill for the gradual abolition of slavery. This law, the Moray Law, freed children born after 1868 and all slaves over the age of 60. And it promised indemnified emancipation of the rest. It also outlawed the use of the whip and freed slaves who were proven to be victims of, quote, excessive cruelty. However, very few slaves were actually freed due to reluctance of the government to enforce the Moray Law and the intransigence of the slave owners. By 1878, 72% of the workers on sugar plantations were still slaves, and spreading unrest forced a frightened slave-owning class to agree to ending slavery in 4 years and to pay workers a wage. To manage the threat of another insurrection, the Spanish Cortes in 1880 abolished slavery in name, but preserved key features of slavery under the so-called patronato system. And this distinction between traditional slavery and the patronato system is quite a delicate one and will need to be explored, possibly at our next meeting. But in summary, the patronato system was a sort of compromise between formal slavery and freedom. Former slaves still owed labor to their former masters, but would be paid a nominal wage. 1/4 of the remaining patrocinados would be granted their full freedom every year in descending order of age, starting in 1885 and ending in 1888. Right? So in each year during that 4-year period, 1/4 of the slaves, patrocinados, would be free. However, the patronato system left in place the fundamental relations of slavery. The master, the patrono, had the right to the labor of the former slave, the patrocinado. The patrono could sell the right to labor, mete out corporal punishment, and runaways had to be returned to him. benefits for patrocinados included a small stipend, education of the young, and possible freedom through, quote, mutual accord or self-purchase. In other words, this patrocinado system was a kind of liberalized slave code. But the patronato system didn't work as planned. The number of patrocinados fell much more rapidly than was anticipated. From a population of 200,000 slaves in 1877, the patrocinado population fell to 100,000 in 1883, 53,000 in 1885, and 25,000 in 1886. By 1880, masters abandoned hope of maintaining slavery in Cuba indefinitely, forever. However, they wanted no interruption of the supply of labor and the ability to operate plantations on their own terms. So-called moral force, fuerza moral, was intended to provide continuity of labor for the masters. So masters continued to serve as sole authorities in their plantations. They used corporal punishment to maintain their authority, and they demanded as much labor from the patrocinados as was needed during the harvest. Nominal wages paid to patrocinados were treated, in effect, as a reward in order to enforce the desired work rhythm. Masters also controlled the flow of information, so patrocinados were isolated on the plantation and provided with plantation stores in order to limit contact with outsiders. On the other hand, some masters were willing to accelerate the transition from slavery to wage labor. So-called mutual agreements between patrono and patrocinado established terms of freedom whereby the patrocinados could purchase their liberty. This possibility of purchasing their freedom also provided an incentive for patrocinados to work steadily. Finally, in October 1886, the Spanish government abolished the patronato system, and that's recognized as that banned slavery finally in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to ban. So a little bit about the involvement of Alicia and Edwin Atkins with all of this. So Alicia Atkins began importing Cuban sugar, which, as we've heard from John, was produced by slave labor, to the United States in 1838. In 1843, he started trading sugar under Atkins and Freeman Incorporated, and then after 1849, he operated as E. Atkins and Co. In around 1877, E. Atkins and Co. acquired Boston's Bay State Sugar Refining Company in payment of indebtedness. The Bay State Sugar Refining Company was one of 17 sugar refineries consolidated into the Havemeyer Sugar Refineries Company. Now, Edwin, Alicia's son, had a long education in the sugar business. So Edwin began working with his father, Alicia, in 1864. Edwin went to Cuba in 1869 instead of college to learn the sugar business from his father's agent in Cienfuegos, a man named Ramon de la Torriente. At age 24, Edwin became a partner in E. Atkins and Co. The 10 Years' War, which John also mentioned, the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878, as well as the sugar price crisis of 1884, forced some Cuban sugar houses into bankruptcy. E. Atkins and Co. acquired bankrupt sugar houses which they had formerly financed. The company became the first American firm to own large sugar estates in Cuba. They added sugar production to their sugar trading. They managed production now as well as trading sugar. Importantly, they also acquired a plantation in Cuba at Soledad. So E. Atkins and Co. acquired Soledad, which was 900 acres in extent and had 180 slaves in 1881. So they acquired this plantation at Soledad from their agent, Ramon de la Torriente, in May 1884 in lieu of debt payment. The estate was managed by J.S. Murray, who I mentioned, who's in the standing figure in the photograph, who was an old acquaintance of Edwin's. The operation on the Soledad plantation became Edwin's personal interest, right? So Soledad produced 4,000 metric tons of sugar in 1887, and he went on to acquire 11 other plantations during the 1880s for a total plantation area of 12,000 acres. Historians have a pretty detailed record of the activities of Alicia and Edwin Atkins in the Atkins Family Papers archive, which is contained in 214 boxes at the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's a lot of boxes. What these documents reveal is that many steps were taken with Edwin Atkins's knowledge to frustrate the intent of the Moray law and the patronato system, and I'll detail some of those. So when Edwin purchased the plantation, when, strictly speaking, his company purchased the plantation, in 1884, 95 patrocinados worked at Soledad. Those patrocinados were eager to purchase their freedom. Murray, Edwin's land manager, continued to accept payments for freedom from 3 patrocinados who were already free under the Moray law. This is quite an important point. So there were some patrocinados who, under the terms of the law, were actually already free because they were over the age of 60, right? But Murray, the land manager, refused to release them and continue to hold them in bondage. Murray campaigned to force the workers also to get rid of their horses. Horses were very important to the patrocinados and slaves. They were emblems of, autonomy and mobility. And of course, they were valuable. Murray wrote in a letter to Edwin, quote, "Almost every Negro on the estate owns a horse, and they're a source of constant trouble in some way." In 1885, Murray forced the workers to sell their hogs. The sale of hogs was a key source of income for patrocinados to purchase their freedom, as well as, of course, for their livelihood, but they needed that capital to purchase their freedom. Murray encountered immediate resistance, which he suppressed through his control of lodging and wages and use of the stocks. Right? So he put some of the patrocinados in the stocks, even though under the terms of the law this was now illegal. Edwin refused Murray's proposal to allow the remaining 55 patrocinados to purchase their freedom immediately, but proposed to continue under the patronato system as long as possible in order to minimize the impact of freeing the patrocinados. This is actually something that you can see. There's a pretty good academic article that quotes some of the letters that are in this collection in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And you can see Murray, who is a pretty rigorous, almost brutal character. I mean, he's knowingly illegally putting some of these patronatos in the stocks to punish them. But it's Murray who is writing to Edwin here in the Boston area and saying, we've got a lot of unrest here. We need to start releasing them under more liberal terms. We should lower the price by which they can buy their freedom. And Edwin essentially writes back and says, no, let's continue under the system of the law, the strict system of the law, because I don't want to lose any value in my account books. So those letters do strongly suggest that Edwin was not in the dark about how these people were being treated by the land manager. Bill notes here that this struggle between the patrocinados and the land manager reflects a deeper kind of structural conflict between the economic interests of the owner class and the interests of the the workers, the patrocinados, for full emancipation. I'm going to say a little bit at the end here about Harvard and the legacy of the slavery reports, which again John touched on earlier. So in 2019, a presidential initiative on Harvard and the legacy of slavery was established at the direction of Harvard's president Larry Bacow to explore and elucidate the connections between Harvard and slavery. Their findings were documented in a 132-page report entitled Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, which is available on the web. It's very easy to find. In the section of the report on Harvard affiliates, slavery, and slave trade into the 19th century, Edwin Atkins is featured as one of the 5 significant donors involved with slavery, the slave trade, and the trade in goods produced by slaves, even after the Civil War. Edwin Atkins donated part of his expanded Soledad plantation to Harvard as a biological research station, which eventually became the Atkins Institution of the Arnold Arboretum as part of Harvard University in 1932. And Harvard still owns it, as I understand. Atkins is also featured on, if you want to look at the report, it's featured on pages 26 and 27 of Harvard's report for 2 things. First, for acquisition of at least 95 formerly enslaved patrocinados when Atkins acquired the Soledad plantation. And secondly, for directing his plantation manager to reduce labor costs, retain control of the black workers, and extract payment for releasing workers from indentured servitude, including those who were already free by the law. Right, so a little bit of this is covered in the Harvard report, but our own research is giving us some more information about this too. But that's Bill's presentation. So thank you, Bill.